Hello, I'm Yonit Levy of Channel 12 in Tel Aviv.
And I'm Jonathan Friedland of The Guardian in London.
And we are Unholy, two Jews on the news from Keshet Podcasts. Jonathan, what you've been up to?
Different tone of voice, Yonit, because in the last few days, you have been Yonit Levy of London because you were here.
Indeed. And in such an impolite, spontaneous Israeli way, I basically called you up and said, hey, free for coffee?
That's right. Coffee, lunch, dinner. We had to push you out of the house. It was wonderful. The first time since we have been doing this, because of COVID and everything else, that we've been able to be face to face. Normally, it's basically been the same experience as anybody listening. It is connecting to each other via technology and just little earphones. But instead, there we were in person, real human beings.
Yes, you are a real human being. That was surprising. Want to give any grades for my gift-giving abilities?
Yes. I am holding in my hand, here it is, the bespoke Unholy mug, which you had commissioned and made. It's the Unholy logo, which will be familiar to you as the sort of symbol for the podcast on your device. But it's great to be able to drink essentially out of your head, which is what I can do.
Which is what you usually do every week anyway.
That's right. I drink in. But no, so we've got the mug there with both of us there. I'm going to hold it up just in case we get a little image, a screen grab. But it's wonderful. And you brought that. And you also brought a T-shirt, which was terrific, with the slogan on the front, "Save it for the podcast," which is what our executive producer, Lior, says to us every time we dare speak outside school hours, as it were. That's what he says, save it for the podcast. So I have that on a T-shirt. I think you had a slightly flattering sense of my size because it's a T-shirt that would look brilliant on my 17-year-old son, slightly unforgiving on me at my stage of life, but still a wonderful thought, Yonit. And you've set the bar high for when I come to Tel Aviv.
Exactly. I was going to say that not everything in life is a competition, but this is. So when you do eventually come here, I set the bar high for you.
Yeah, I'm going to have to bring tacky London souvenirs, little toy red buses. I think your kids might like toy red buses. I think I'm going to do that.
And you think they don't have like 60 of them by now? That's nice.
Because such well-traveled parents, so you bring back gifts from all the capitals of the world.
And when you, that's just from this visit, the 60 buses. When you do eventually come, we were so excited this time that we have only one picture that we will never release to the world because I was in a bad hair day, but we will document every move you make in the Holy Land. When you do eventually come here.
Yes. And in fact, we will
your move, Friedland.
We are going to get a bit of a steer on when I and many millions of others are going to be able to come to Israel because we are talking COVID. One of the things I've been saying for ages is that Israel, during the COVID period, acquired this very unique, in Israel's experience, status of being discussed and talked about around the world, not because of the conflict or politics, but because it has been setting such a lead on COVID. And so finally, I think we are going to get to hear from someone who really knows about how Israel is handling it all.
How Israel is handling and looking at the rest of the world and what's happening in the UK here now and what's happening at the US. So our special guest today is Dr. Sharon Alroy-Preis. She is Israel's Director of Public Health Services. In this country, I have to tell you, Jonathan, probably the face most associated with battling COVID, Israel's Dr. Fauci, if you like. So we'll say hello to her now. Dr. Sharon Alroy-Preis, thank you so much for talking to us today.
Thank you for having me.
By the way, how frequently do you talk to Dr. Fauci? Just
since the booster session, we've talked several times.
Because I have this image of all of you, all the people who are in this job all over the world having kind of 7 a.m. calls with each other, comparing notes, trading data. That's my image of it. Is that not how it is?
It is. I have to say that there are several sessions like that. We have sessions with the CDC and with the UK every other week. We have sessions by professionals from the Ministry of Health every week with Europe and with USA. So there are a lot of points of when we consult each other. Definitely.
Because my interest in all this is that unusually, and Yonit and I have talked about this on the podcast quite a bit, this has been one of these unusual cases where the world has been watching Israel. It's interesting hearing what countries you're watching, but the world has been watching Israel really from the start because Israel was out of the block so quickly in terms of vaccination. And there's been this idea that, where Israel goes, the rest of the world will follow a few months later, perhaps. If that premise is broadly, right, what, in a nutshell, do you think at the moment, what are the signals from Israel telling us?
I think the main encouraging thing is that the booster is working. So the first signal was that there was waning and we need a booster. But I think the optimistic part now is that the booster is working. And even though everything is open, the economy is open, the schools are open, we see the pandemic, the disease surge coming down. And that's due to the effect of the booster. So I think the main thing for other countries, obviously every country has to do their own calculation where they are in the pandemic, how many people are vaccinated, when they were vaccinated, what type of vaccination they were given. But at some point when the disease surge goes up, we see this in Eastern Europe right now. We see an increase in the UK now. There is a decision to be made about the booster, and I hope that the results from Israel can help other countries in their decision.
Because Israel is really unique. First of all, being at the vanguard and the first country to decide to give the booster and vaccinating large parts of the population, not only the at-risk population, also deciding that anyone who has passed essentially 6 months since their second vaccine will not receive a green pass. All of these things, you believe that the rest of the world would follow suit on this eventually?
Again, every country has to decide, depending on their situation. This was the right decision for Israel, and I can explain why. We saw an increase in the number of cases to more than 10,000 a day for several days. We were in a reproduction number of 1.4, which means that every 10 days we're doubling the numbers. We started to see increase in severe and critically ill patients and increase in the death rates, the mortality from it. And what we saw is in this surge of disease, we had 50 to 55, sometimes 60% vaccinated individuals because the vaccine was not really giving them the same protection as it used to give. So in that kind of decision, when we are with these data, we understand that it's not helpful to just vaccinate the 60 and above. We saw a lot of 40 to 60 people doubly vaccinated who have passed 6, 7, 8 months since their second vaccines, coming into severe and critically ill conditions in the hospital, even dying. So when you have such a surge of disease, there's really no other choice. If there are other countries where the disease is more manageable, maybe more different situation where you have more restrictions, there are countries where they do curfews here and there, not everything is open, maybe you can have other decisions. But in Israel, when everything is open and we see infections spread so immensely, then this is the right choice.
See, what you're saying there really helps explain for people who are not scientists, people like me, how to understand these figures around the world. Because right now, a lot of people in Britain, for example, are getting very worried that the British figure is way ahead of the rest of Europe, for example. The case numbers are just really high on the graph. And meanwhile, you look across the Atlantic, the United States, their figures, they're going in the right kind of direction. They look pretty low. What you're saying about waning, I wonder if that is the explanation, that because Britain wasn't as fast as Israel, but because Britain was quite quick, therefore the effect is sort of wearing off 6 months later. And because America was quite slow, their people are still covered because they haven't had the waning effect yet. Is that broadly the pattern?
So part of it is the waning, part of it is isolation policy and other restriction policy in the country. So waning is not the whole picture, but it's a big part of it.
So is that our future? Are we looking into just a kind of booster shot every 6 months, or we don't have enough data about the current booster to know that?
I was asked the same question by the FDA when we presented, and I sat there and I'm saying here, I don't have the crystal ball. Unfortunately, we don't know the answer for that. There are some viruses like hepatitis where you give the first dose, then after a month, a second dose, and then after 6 months, a booster dose, and you're done for years. You're covered. With corona, we don't know yet. It depends on the whole pandemic situation. If most of the world will be vaccinated and there will start to be a drop in the pandemic and it will stop being pandemic, maybe we won't need anything at all. On the other hand, this virus currently is not stable. From the Delta variant, we have several subvariants right now. One of them is a bit concerning. And so if you have such a shift in the virus, that's a reason to think maybe we will need a booster sooner rather than later. But I don't know if it's 6 months or a month or a year or, several years. We don't know it yet.
It's so interesting you saying about we don't have a crystal ball, because I realize partly the interest people have about Israel is they think that's the closest we get to a crystal ball, right? We look at Israel and we'll see what our imminent future is going to be. I wondered about what the Israel evidence or experience tells us about non-vaccine related measures. And I'm thinking particularly of masking, because indoor mask wearing was a thing in Britain and now suddenly is really not. And people are not wearing them, partly because they've got so much faith in the vaccine. Again, lessons from Israel. What is the Israeli evidence telling us about whether or not people should still be wearing masks indoors?
So it's a good question and a difficult one to answer. I will take you back to the beginning of the pandemic when we had nothing at all. We didn't have restrictions. We didn't have a green pass. We didn't have anything at all. And then we had this pandemic surge, and people just started putting masks. With the utilization of masks, the reproduction number dropped. So that was the only time when we used one measure and we can show the effect of that measure. And in addition to that, the compliance to that measure at that point in time was high because the Ministry of Health said you need to put masks, and people were afraid of the virus, and they put masks. And so you can actually see the drop in the reproduction number. So
surprisingly, Israelis did what they were told.
And so at that point in time, so we have that period of time when we can say we can actually analyze what was the impact of masks and masks alone. After that period of time, everything else that you will ask me, I would not have a good question, because every time we did a step, usually it was more than one step.
So wrong policy there in the UK, Jonathan. If you
tell me. Absolutely.
You discussed briefly, you mentioned the subvariant of Delta. I wanted to hear how concerned you are, and also considering the fact that Israel is supposed to be opening its borders for tourists in November. Can you talk about, are you worried that certain mutations might now enter when that is the case?
Yeah, I think we have two challenges in this pandemic. One is the schools and education, and the fact you have this huge population non-vaccinated, and you want to keep the routine good and healthy, and it's important. And the other zone is the borders, and how can we control the borders? And you want to balance. The easiest thing would be, let's just close the borders. No one coming in, no one going out. Now we'll know we're safe. You can't really live with COVID like that. You have to find the right balance. And I think the increase in cases in the beginning of the fourth wave in Israel was really interesting. We were trying to find this balance. We let people, at least out, Israelis obviously in. Tourism was not allowed to a really maximal effect. But Israelis came, went out and in, and we started seeing people coming, confirmed cases. At the beginning, it was like 10 a day, and then 30 a day, and then 50 a day, and then we got to 200 a day of confirmed cases. We want people going out and in. We are afraid or concerned. Afraid is not a good word. We're concerned about viruses and variants. We have several variants that we're now following. There is one in the UK that is to some extent concerning because it is circulating in a country that is vaccinated in a Delta wave. So maybe it beats Delta, maybe it's stronger than Delta. So it is concerning, but we have to find some sort of a balance. What we are trying in Israel is to make sure that we have safeguards, like everyone entering the country has to have 72 hours prior to boarding PCR. They have to do PCR testing when they land. Like, these are two rules that we will try not to break, because we're trying to keep infections out. And then for travel, to make sure that people coming in are vaccinated. And this is, again, a difficult point now, because Israeli vaccinated is not the UK vaccinated. People in the UK are considered vaccinated after 2 shots, even if 8 months has passed. In Israel, they're not considered protected anymore. So we're trying to find this balance of allowing people to come into Israel, but making sure that the risk for disease is them entering with disease is lower.
Yeah, no, I'm not going to be booking any flights just yet. Listening to what you just say there, I can imagine Plague Island, Britain may well be will be on the red list. But I'm just interested in this idea of keeping out people who are not protected when Israel has so many people within who are not protected. Forget Tripoli jab. You've got people, I think 700,000 Israelis who aren't protected at all. I'm just interested again for what you've learned from that in terms of as a lesson for the rest of the world. 700,000 people are not protected at all. What does that do to the immunity, the protection of the herd overall if you have that's around 10% or so, give or take, of the population who have not had their shots?
So herd immunity is an important term, and most of the times you know it in retrospect. So I can say now that for the Alpha variant, we had 65% of the population covered, immunized, protected, either immunized or recovered individuals, and that was enough for herd immunity. So 35% were not protected, mostly kids. And we went out of this wave. Then came the Delta, and the Delta is 50% more infectious. And so the level you need for protection for herd immunity, the percent of population that needs to be protected is now higher. We don't know exactly what it is, but it is higher. But once we are seeing now that the disease surge is coming down, we can say that probably those 700,000 who are not protected are not probably going to stop us from achieving herd immunity. But we want to make sure that they are protected. So if I'm looking at a national level, yes, it's important that everyone will be immunized, protected. We want to make sure that even between the waves, we continue to immunize people, because we know we're not done with corona. It will come again and again in waves. But I'm actually concerned about those people, the well-being and the health of those people who are not immunized. I think the people who are on anti-vaccines are really minority of them. It's not 700,000 people who are objecting vaccines. It's populations that for some reason we were not able to go into. We were not able to explain to them the data, the science, the importance. And so they are at risk 10 times higher to get infected and to die, even at young ages. But those who did not even get the first shot, in my opinion, the most of them are not people who are religiously objecting vaccinations. There is this small minority who are very vocal, by the way. But I think the larger part are people who are either concerned because there are a lot of fake news out there about the side effects, the danger, fake news about the disease. It's not dangerous. It's not contagious. And so we need to fight that with science and with data. And there are some populations that are hardworking, low socioeconomic. They're just not in the news. They're not in the media. They're not in Twitter. They're not in Facebook. We're not reaching them. And we are trying in different ways to find how to get to them. People in the south of the country, the Bedouin in the south, to get to them with their physicians, with their doctors, reaching out to them with special cars that comes with the vaccines and explaining to them why it's important. But it's a challenge. It really is. I don't think on the national level, when we're seeing the numbers go down right now, I don't think that in the national level, those 700,000 are now stopping us from getting to this point of herd immunity. They probably are not, but they're endangering themselves. And that's, to me, I'm concerned about their health as well. I can't just say, you chose not to be vaccinated. Yeah. Tough luck for you. It is our job to try to get to them with the data, with the science, with explanation, with the vaccines, and try to make sure that they're doing the right choice for them.
Obviously the biggest group that isn't vaccinated yet are the children 5 to 12. I assume we're expecting the FDA's decision on this really any day now. You said last week that Israel giving the green light is not guaranteed. You want to check it for yourself. I wondered what when you think they will actually begin to vaccinate children, and how confident are you that parents in Israel would kind of stand in line to get their kids vaccinated from the age of 5, from the early age of 5?
That's a great question, and I will add to your question that I don't know how much enthusiasm would be for vaccination when the disease surge is on its way down, when the wave is coming down. We saw the same thing for the 12 to 15 years old. We had approval of the 20 to 15 years old at the beginning of June. And people did not run to get vaccinated. Kids did not go to be vaccinated at that early stage. I think what will be important is to explain to parents that once the virus is coming up with let's say a fifth wave, it goes up exponentially. And then in that point in time, our decision to vaccinate kids and give them that protection will take, for the first child being vaccinated, it will take a month until they're protected, because you have the first shot after 21 days, the second shot, then a week. So for the first kid, it will take a month until that kid is protected. And if you have a surge and it goes up very quickly, it's too late because the exponential rise, and we saw it in the numbers in the fourth wave, 10 times, 15 times cases in 10 days. It was like this. And so if parents really want to make their kids protected, make sure that they are protected, it's better to do it even if you don't have anything right now brewing in Israel. We're in the downhill of the wave because we think there probably will be a fifth wave. And I would like my kids to be protected when it comes, and not then start to vaccinate them and wait for the effect.
You talked about your view of this as a parent, but just being the person at the helm, steering a country through a crisis like this, just on a human level, I'm very keen to know what that is like for you. We'd mentioned Dr. Fauci. It's a handful of people around the world who will know what it is like to be in the chair that you're sitting in. And just tell us what that's like, and what keeps you up at night, and are you just thinking about this the minute you fall asleep and the minute you wake up again? I mean, talk us through it.
Wow, that's a difficult question, but I'll try to do my best to answer. I don't have nights, and I don't have nights not because I'm working too hard. I am working very hard, but there is not a moment of rest. The burden of the responsibility, knowing that every decision that you make, it's not us making the decision, but every decision that we offer for our policymakers to decide has impact, not just the health from corona, but also mental health issues that can happen if you're trying to make sure that everyone is staying in a curfew or in a lockdown because you don't want infection to spread. The burden on business people who may be losing their business because we need to now restrict all sorts of activities. It's challenging. It's really hard. And I think one of the difficult part is when you're trying really all your best, thinking during the day and at night what to do better, what decisions we've made that we should have done better for the next time. I think the distance between where we're coming from, trying really in this difficult, unknown zone to make the best decisions, and how it sometimes is perceived. And I think that makes it even harder.
I'm really worried about you not having nights. Are you literally up all night then? What does that mean?
It means that I never had problems falling into sleep or waking up. And this more than a year has been sleepless, really sleepless. Like I'm waking up in the middle of the night thinking what we need to do, how to do better, what kind of data is still missing, what do we need to compare to other countries, just because we're on this unknown territory. And especially when Israel is so forward in this pandemic, we don't even have other countries to look into. Like we need to make our own decisions without data from anywhere else. And I remember the first time when we released the data that our vaccine effectiveness dropped to 60%, everyone nearly cut our head off. Like in the UK, it's 88%. In the USA, it's you don't know, you're missing. Saying no, we're not missing. Like trust us, we're looking at this data very closely. So it's hard, it's challenging, but it's important.
Well, we can just say thank you very much, not only for this conversation, which was illuminating, but for all of the work that you're doing. And hopefully someday this will be over and you can take a very long vacation, well-deserved. And thank you so much for talking to us today.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. I've got to say, I mean, wow, about her and that interview. I found her so compelling, especially at the end, talking about this very particular burden of being the Dr. Fauci. There's dozens of these Dr. Faucis around the world, but the one who has no other model to look at because Israel went first, and how that's kind of lonely. And I just listen to her and just think, I can't be the only one who thinks this. Tell me, there must be Israelis who think, if she can run the handling of the pandemic this well, let her run the country. I mean, what an amazing person. Are people talking about a political career for her?
Not yet. There have been a few skirmishes between her and the prime minister in the way that this is handled. She's definitely, she's a very compelling speaker. And again, as you said, her talk about the responsibility and the attempt. Just think of how you're trying to realize and make decisions, even though you kind of feel like you're in the darkness completely. She did talk about fifth wave, which wasn't a fun thing to listen to.
I know.
But
that got me as well.
All in all, that was a really, really interesting conversation. And I think that when you realize there are serious people in these positions, maybe there's a little bit of comfort in that.
I thought so. I have no nights. That is going to stay with me.
Yes.
I have no nights. But we have other business to attend to.
We do. Our mentioned Chutzpah Awards, Jonathan. Somehow you have allocated the Chutzpah Awards to me.
Yeah, I'm going to be Mr. Nice Guy this week. I'll do Mensch. You
this
give
week,
us
you're Mr. Nice Guy
chutzpah.
every week. You always take the Mensch Awards to yourself, which is, that's fine. Fine. I've yet to fight against that. So this will not surprise you. Of course, it's not a story that blew up this week, but I must, for this week's episode, still nominate Sally Rooney. Not surprised, are you, Jonathan? I'm sure. This story started in Arts newspaper reporting that Rooney decided to not sell Hebrew publishing rights for her new book to Modan Publishing House, which was the publishing house that published her first two novels in Hebrew. And then she put out a statement saying, "It would be an honor for me to have my latest novel translated into Hebrew, but for the moment I've chosen not to sell these translations to an Israeli-based publishing house." Can we pause on that for a second? Because what it actually says is, of course I don't mind translating my books into Hebrew, I just don't want it translated by any publisher in a country where Hebrew is spoken. Or in other words, of course I want my books to be translated Hebrew, I just don't want any Hebrew speakers to read them.
So that would give, I think, if it had been left at just the first go at this, when it was reported, and I think, maybe lost in translation, but initially it seemed like she was saying, I don't want my book in the Hebrew language, right? That was how it was first sort of went into circulation, this story. And that shocked everyone, and she would be a slam dunk nominee for Chutzpah Award then, because it was as if I don't want the taint of this Jewish language touching my book. Mm-hmm. So she then came up with this statement, which I thought was very sort of clever, really, because she sort of dealt with, well, clever, not wholly in a positive way. It was sort of canny, because what she did was she dealt with all the first objections. And you notice quite a lot of people who had initially criticized her then backed off, because she said, no problem with Hebrew. It just needs to be an Israeli publisher who complies with the BDS standards, boycott, divestment, sanctions. So it seemed
good luck
like,
finding that, by the way.
And she said, it would be an honor to be in Hebrew. And I know I've listened to people who said, what about all the other countries and China and Russia? You don't boycott their languages. And she had an answer for that. It was that people used to say that, when the South Africa boycott was happening, there were other bad things going on in the world then too, and you can't do everything, but people did the South Africa boycott even though they didn't boycott 20 other countries, because I'm listening, she said, to the call from civil society. To which my response was, have you guessed, Sally Rooney, why there's no call from Chinese civil society for a boycott over the Uyghurs? That's because they're not allowed, right? They wouldn't be allowed, and maybe the same in Russia too, but certainly in China, it's not as if they're just freely mingling and saying, you know what, I think it'll be fine to have normal people in Mandarin. They're just not able to issue that call. So I thought that was a bit weak.
Yeah, let's not feign innocence, right? I mean, in the sense that no one's going to take on China because Chinese audience is huge. There are no brownie points in criticizing China. It's too big and powerful. Slamming Israel makes you look good. You don't sacrifice anything, and you keep your first row in the echo chamber. That is for sure. Look, you and I had what you would call a spirited debate back in, I'm sure you remember this, episode 14, when we talked about the Human Rights Watch report accusing Israel of apartheid, right? And we said there at the point, you said, actually, that this is a watershed moment. And I would add to that, the people who needed an excuse took that as an excuse, not because it's true. I think it's disingenuous to say that about Israel. But I think the people who needed the excuse at that moment had the excuse, and Sally Rooney used this excuse. Again, we are living in a time where context is ignored and history is ignored, and the part of the Palestinians and the Israelis in this situation we are in is ignored. The ins and the outs are ignored. It's all sloganeering. It's like students calling cops fascists, right? It's not true, but it makes you look cool. So it makes her look cool. But, I think that many Israelis were really offended by this. And they weren't less offended because you said, oh, of course, if there is a Hebrew publishing company that supports BDS, I'll love for them to trans. Come on, Jonathan. That's just, it's a little...
Just on that one point, my guess is that somebody, by the way, will do a Hebrew translation as a little ebook somewhere out of New York or something, so that it can be said, look, she didn't have a problem with the language. Somebody will do that. I've been waiting for that to happen. I think, look, first, you're right about mentioning the Human Rights Watch report, because Sally Rooney did name check that in her statement. And it did remind me of the conversation you and I had. And at the time I did say, look, this is going to trigger something. And it goes with what we also talked about in the summer during the 11-day conflict where, Viva Palestine, etc., Free Palestine becomes the new Black Lives Matter. And so as a matter of it being a kind of fashionable cause, this is more evidence. And the idea that it wouldn't be a one-off. We've seen it now on the streets of London. There are posters appearing in bus shelters sort of simulating the cover art from her novel saying normal people boycott Israel. And they're not official posters, and the Transport for London Authority that is in charge of the bus stops say they are an act of vandalism because they're unofficial, and they'll come down. But here's the thing for me. I'm prepared to give her a bit more credit than you, in the sense that you said, I think, she's doing it to be cool and fashionable. I want to say, look, I give her credit that she's doing it out of conscience. She thinks it's a very important issue. She's seen the Human Rights Watch report and thinks, okay, I've got to do something. My problem is, those may be her intentions. The trouble with cultural boycotts is their effect and their outcome. And it seems to me the limited outcome they have in the country itself, in Israel, is to deprive people who probably would agree with Sally Rooney in terms of opposing the occupation and being in favor of compromise, the kind of people who'd read Sally Rooney novels. They're now not going to be able to read it. So you hurt the sort of very people you'd want as allies. But the main thing is it plays out outside Israel. And so it ends up on bus shelters and bus stops in London. And the impact is on Jewish communities usually in diaspora, they're the ones who actually feel this stuff in the end. The example I always give is a case that happened in 2014 after the eruption of violence then and Israel's offensive in Gaza at the time, where a Jewish guy walks into Sainsbury's supermarket in Holborn in London looking for kosher products. The entire kosher section is cleared out and empty. His account is that he asks one of the shop assistants, where's all the kosher food? And they say, we support Free Gaza here. Sainsbury's afterwards said, no, that it wasn't the case. We removed all the goods because we were worried about anti-Israel protesters outside the store. Either way, the boycott issue, one way or another, hits Jews. It's about kosher food. It's about Jewish customers in London. And I think that's my problem with boycotts. It's only a tactic. It's not some holy principle. So I'd say to Sally Rooney, I get your conscience on Israel and Palestine. Wrong tactic.
Yeah, I would just add to that, if you want to criticize Israel, believe me, Israelis criticize their government better than any other nation on the world. If you want to criticize only Israel, I would question your integrity or your motivation. And as you say, I think that boycotting people who read books, what at the end are you trying to accomplish? I mean, that is a group, I just don't really understand that.
Now, to Mensch of the week. Always better. We very often have turned this into Unholy's own little obituaries page, and I know it's not always good to do that, but I think probably the stand-up candidate for Mensch of the week would be the late Colin Powell. The word was used in a lot of obituaries for him, interestingly, partly because it turns out it's not completely inapposite to use a Yiddish word for him. He knew and had quite good Yiddish. He'd worked for a Jewish-owned store when he was in high school, and he tended to pepper his conversation with Yiddish terms when the time was right.
Yeah, he grew up in the Bronx, so he made friends with a lot of Jewish families.
No, the main reason I thought he deserved Mensch is because, unexpectedly, of the thing that he regarded as a real blot on his career. And that was that presentation he did at the UN, making the case for war against Iraq and saying Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, which, of course, famously they didn't. Now, I'm not saying that was a good thing. I'm saying his reaction to it, the fact that he expressed public regret later, which he did repeatedly, and said he was wrong, used the word blot on his own career. I think that is so rare that it really deserves recognition. It was a rare thing in public life. Many of the other people involved in the Iraq disaster have not done that. I think of Tony Blair, for example, and I think for that he wins my nomination as Mensch of the week.
Yeah, I don't know why I keep having this line. Maybe I do know why I keep having this line from Hamilton in my head. You have no control. Who lives, who dies, who tells your story. At the end of the day, this is a war hero from the Vietnam. He was the first African-American chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He was the first African-American Secretary of State. And the one thing that you will remember tragically is that moment in November 5th, 2003, when he's holding up the vial in front of the UN Security Council saying, I have solid sources, right? And there's WMD in Iraq. Again, you said he regretted it. And he's not a victim of the situation, right? He took part in this. But it makes you wonder about how someone can be so accomplished, even flirting with the idea of running for president. And at the end of the day, that is the one thing that you will remember. I think that the world will remember. And that is pretty harsh. It's a pretty harsh way of history kind of looking at him.
Yeah. I remember in the mid-90s, there was really big talk in the Republican Party of him running for president. And you know what was the decisive factor in his mind against doing it? Was his wife, Alma, said, are you serious? A black man running for president? They will shoot you. They will assassinate you. And obviously, 13 years later, there was a black president. But I think that too is all part of the rounded picture of Colin Powell, our Mensch of the week.
Yes. Well, Jonathan, we're back to Zoom from 3D, which is a bit of a downgrade, but this is how we will continue from now on until you get yourself on a plane.
Till I get ourselves to there.
Although if you're listening to Sharon Alroy, that might not happen in the near future.
I know, the
but
fifth
let's
wave,
stay.
my word.
Let's stay
All right,
optimistic.
so we have to say to people, having lifted your spirits with talk of a fifth wave, recommend us to your friends, give us nice reviews
Always
as
the
you
best
have been
cocktail
doing.
time chatter with us.
Always the best. We've had vials of mass destruction and fifth wave of global pandemics. You come to Unholy for all the cheery news. Recommend us to your friends. And who do we have to thank?
Lior Friedman, our eternal executive producer, whom we love and cherish, and of course Romantic, head of podcasts, and Omer Primat. And I think Irad Eshel for original music.
Yeah, we'll see each other next week.
We will.